It's been reported that more than half of people in Britain have not made a will. Joining me now to discuss the financial implications of that is the Chief Officer of Salford Citizens Advice Bureau, Tom Togher. Tom, thanks very much for joining us. Firstly, it's not something people want to think about, really, is it, writing a will?
No. And I think it's one of those situations where it's all very well people like me saying you ought to do things. And in truth, it's only when things go wrong that people realise the value and the importance of doing things like financial planning and making a will. So we would always say, be prepared and consider the worst case scenario.
And just talk us through the implications if someone doesn't make a will, because the laws are quite strict about how property is divided up unless you say otherwise.
Yeah, that's exactly the position, that if you die without a will, you die intestate, which means that the law governs how your assets will be distributed. It is actually very complicated. It's not very straightforward to work out how that will be. But the formula will generally protect the married or civil partnered spouse of the person. And other than that, there'll be a formula to distribute any of the estate.
So arguably there's even more of a case, particularly for people whose marital arrangements have changed, that it becomes vital that they make a will.
And especially people who are not actually married or civil partnered. I mean, people often talk of common law wives or husbands. It's a great misconception. And people who are not actually married are in a very vulnerable position when it comes to wills and dying without wills being made. There's another thing that people often forget about, is the importance of making wills for the interest of safeguarding children in relationships and making sure that there's somebody named to look after a child in the event of the parent with parental responsibility actually dying before they expected to.
So when's the right time to think about making a will? Is it when you have a child or buy a house? What should be the trigger?
I mean, I think that's quite a good way of thinking about it. Any time that your life changes quite substantially would be a really good time to think about making a will. And then keeping that will up to date is another problem, that people's life changes. People have children, people unfortunately get divorced or separated, and they move, their circumstances change, their health changes.
I suppose that's as much a part of it, is making sure it's up to date and current as much as writing it in the first place.
Absolutely. So once a will is written, it should be thought of as something that someone comes back to every few years, that they review and they consider whether the will is fit for purpose.
And the other thing, in terms of a will that's valid, you often see these sort of write-your-own-will packs in supermarkets and so on. Do those carry legal weight, or do you need to do it properly?
Yes, I mean, there's no reason why a person can't write their own will, and essentially those sorts of things you buy in stationery shops are to help people make their own wills. We would, Citizens Advice would always recommend that people go to somebody who is actually qualified to write a will, who knows a little bit more about it, because it is quite complex. And to make sure it's safe and sound, we would advise you go to a solicitor. But in doing that, there are issues to think about, because one of the real problems are who will be your executors, who will deal with your estate once you die. And generally speaking, it's best that that's perhaps somebody who you trust and rely on.
OK, Tom, some useful advice there. Thanks very much for joining us on the show this evening.